Hello and welcome to the How to Succeed podcast. This is How to Succeed at Silencing the Imposter Syndrome. Not an official medical diagnosis. That's what it's called when you feel like you are ready to wimp out. When you're giving up, you're not sure of yourself, you're doubting yourself. We're going to figure out with Gary Frey, author of Silence the Imposter, how you deal with that and how you can find your courage, get it done, take some action. All good things here today. The show is brought to you by Sandler, the worldwide leader in sales management and customer service training with over 200 locations. More information at sandler.com. Gary, tell us about the new book. Why did you write it and who's it for?
Well, it's pretty much for, they say 70% of the population deals with this, with these thoughts of I'm in over my head. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not as good as you think I am. You know, I got to hide this or that because you're going to reject me if you knew this or that about me. That is kind of the essence of it. And why I wrote it was because I suffered from it. I didn't know that this term for 4 years, probably until 4 years ago, but I suffered from it from the time I was a little kid. Never being good enough. Mr. Perfect. I was teased all the time. I was just trying so hard, you know, oldest kid. I don't know why. It wasn't because my parents were driving that into me. They were trying to put the brakes on it, you know, but I couldn't deal with it. But I didn't write the book because of me. I wrote the book because I had a woman who was the CEO of a 10,000 person organization. She now has 12,000 and she's also already sold one of her companies. So she's an amazing CEO. Her name's Tana Green. She's one of the few people that I actually mention by name in the book. And she said, Gary, I don't know what I'm doing. and I mean, she is an amazing, purpose-driven, she has just got it together. And I said, Tana, why would you say that? And she said, I only have a 2-year secretarial degree. I said, Tana, I think that's imposter syndrome. And then it was shortly thereafter that I realized, wait a minute, the first guy that I brought in as a client to our CPA firm 5 years ago when I joined, first guy has 3 companies, works 10 hours a week total. He loves playing golf. He's one of the few entrepreneurs that I know that actually loves playing golf. And he said the same thing. I said, Brent, why would you say that? And he goes, I don't have any education. I just finished high school. Think about this. This guy has more money than any of us would imagine. He works 10 hours a week in his 3 companies. And he's way younger than me. I'm 62. He's probably in his mid 40s. But this whole less than thing is a plague. And so
I'll share some opening thoughts on it because I think it is a really interesting topic and I'm excited to jump into it. One is it turns out on the road, everybody has the opposite of the imposter syndrome. Did you know this? That over like 60% of drivers rate themselves as better than average, which is statistically impossible. But you know, anybody that drives faster than you is a maniac. Anybody that drives slower than you is an idiot. And you think like, you know, exactly the right way to do things. But in our lives, the opposite is actually true. Like we don't give ourselves enough credit. We think that everybody else is thinking about us, and statistically, they're all thinking the same thing about themselves, right? 70% of our time is spent thinking about ourselves, not other people. So this whole time we're worried about what other people think, and it turns out that they don't.
Right.
It is the answer, right? So when we think about the ideal attitude here, it's somewhere in between, right? We want a healthy self-awareness of our own strengths and weaknesses. We want a healthy dose of feedback and awareness of our audience and who we're trying to serve and how we can help other people. But healthy is the key, and separating, you know, our self-worth, our identity from what we do or our results that we're getting, I think is the hard part here. What are your thoughts on that? What's the ideal attitude?
Yeah, I think you're right. Balance is, you know, finding equilibrium we're always going through life where we see these pendulum swings, right? And I think the extremes is where we get in trouble, right? Because what you described is the Dunning-Kruger effect, where we have far more confidence in our abilities than we actually should. That's
right.
Dunning-Kruger. So we're completely blind. As a good therapist friend of mine says, we're all blind in one eye and can't see out of the other. And that there's a lot of truth to that. But then on the other extreme, we have this comparison problem. And the whole imposter syndrome, like people think, oh, well, that's a new term. No, it was developed in the 1970s by two female psychologists who observed these thoughts and these behaviors that were plaguing high achieving females in the early 1970s. Well, since then, we've seen that, oh gosh, it's not just women. And they say conservatively 70% of the population deals with it. I do know that narcissists and sociopaths have no empathy, so I don't think it affects them at all. They probably are much more on the Dunning-Kruger effect side. However, what I have seen is I believe that C-suite execs, because that's who I've coached since the late 1990s and worked with a lot of some very notable ones. They're the ones, it seems like the high achievers suffer from it the most. Hollywood stars, A-listers, all that, because their performance, they're gauged by their performance. They're given accolades when inside they're comparing everybody else's show reels with our behind the scenes reels, the stuff that we don't want anybody else to know, the outtakes, the flubs, etc. And that dichotomy is a huge issue, and it's really running rampant in college universities and down even to junior high now.
Social media is crushing this,
yes.
right? I wanted to highlight what you said there, because that was one of my favorite parts of your book was we are seeing this highlight reel of other people's lives. We're seeing their vacation photos. We're not seeing their debt on the credit card from those vacations, or how they lived the rest of the week, or when the kids were having the meltdown at Disneyland. We only saw the happy photo that was one, a half a second of this whole week-long vacation. And like, I love what you said. We're seeing the behind the scenes footage of our own lives. We're seeing like how the sausage is made here. You're like, oh, I didn't know what I was doing. I just made that up. Or I had to Google the answer to that question. And we're not seeing that with other people. That's a huge deal.
Yeah. And I think anytime, so with salespeople, with, C-suite people, anytime you're doing something that you haven't done before, or it's out of your comfort zone, boom, the imposter is starting to just chirp in your back. It's just incessant. And that's why, the book really, so it has some of my story in the back of it. And I wrote that first, and then I put it down because I'm like, I don't want this book to be about me because it's not that interesting. However, the really tough times, and we've been through some really tough times, the tough times are where I learned these big lessons and these things that are really simple. Simple doesn't mean easy. Simple things that you can do to just punch imposter syndrome in the mouth. I mean, really to just silence it. And that's where the 7 weapons are on the front, so that if somebody doesn't want to read my story, that's fine. You could dive into these first 7 weapons and you can finish the book in an hour or under, probably, for that part. So
yeah, I want to talk about some of those in just a second, but I do think it's important to tie this back to salespeople and leaders. I think you've mentioned leaders several times. I had this as a salesperson. I didn't think that as a Sandler trainer, my dad was a trainer. So I took this in high school, and in my 20s, I thought, coming out of college, I thought, I'm 22 years old. I can't go into a business owner's office and be like, here's what you should do with your sales team. It's like, what do I know? I've never run a sales team. Well, it turns out most business owners haven't spent 6 years learning sales training or working with other companies that have a wide different experience. They only have their little niche of experience, and we all do. And so unfortunately, it wasn't until I turned 30 that I was like, oh, I can do this. Like I'm not going to be the business owner, but I can be a resource for business owners.
Yeah.
And it clicked for me. So I wanted to ask you about these 7 weapons. When we think of behavior, the one that you sort of hit the most throughout the book and your story is this thrive or wither thing. And I think that's a lot of behavior for us, of how do we do the right thing at the right time? How do we lean into our strengths, and how do we maybe minimize, outsource, move away from things that cause us to shrink, wimp out, or wither? What are your thoughts on behavior when I say that word?
Well, first of all, everybody probably listening to this has done a strengths and weaknesses assessment. I would hope so. I would hope so. If you haven't, do. However, strengths and weaknesses is not going to cut it in really understanding where do you fit. And that question of where do I fit, that was a question that plagued me for freaking ever. Why? Because I'm trying to fit in somebody else's mold. And guess what? Most salespeople don't. And they don't fit the stereotype of, people that are non-salespeople think used car salesmen. No. They think, oh, well, all you do is talk all the time. Actually, the less you do, the better you do. So wrong.
Turns out the job is listening. Yeah,
exactly. So the Thrive Wither came out of necessity. I did my first turnaround when I was 28 years old, had no idea what I was doing, didn't feel qualified, but we turned it in a significant way. Wonderful. I catch my partner embezzling twice, 3.5 years later. That's a problem. That's a real problem, because my name was on the door, his name was on the door, and I have this choice of either have to destroy this man who is 20 years older than me. He actually graduated from Kansas State. I did not. I dropped out. And so, and everybody in town in Wichita, Kansas knew who he was, because he had been the head of corporate communications for Cessna Aircraft. Everybody in Wichita, Kansas knew this guy. Everybody in town pretty much knew who we were, because we had built this really cool 30-something back in the day. There was a television show, 30-something, and we built that kind of a firm. We did a old chili factory. We were the hip and happening place to be. Well, so my choice is I either destroy him or I destroy my name if I take the agency I built across the street and I don't out him. Good name is to be valued above great riches. So what am I going to do? And I was in a conundrum, because my mentor, who was one of the big hitters in the entire advertising world, a guy named Ron Anderson, he was up in Minneapolis, and he split time. He was the chief creative officer and vice chairman of Bozell Worldwide, big Interpublic group. I think they were Interpublic group. And so he split time between New York City and Minneapolis. And I confided in him after I discovered what happened. And he said, come to New York or be with me in Minneapolis. I couldn't do that, because in my Thrive Wither, one of the things that was really important to me was my family. And I could not see my family in New York City. And I also couldn't see them in Minneapolis, because my wife had a medical condition at the time that extreme cold would have really exacerbated. And so while my career was extremely important, these other things were far more important. I wanted balance. So we talked about balance earlier on. I wanted balance. And so I listed the stuff, and I was only 32 years old at the time, but I listed the stuff that made me come alive, the kind of environments, because I'd been around, I'd been working since I was 20. So I described for myself the kind of problems I like to solve, the kind of environments, the kind of people I liked working with, the kind of issues I like dealing with. And then I also put in my wither column the stuff that just drained my tank. And here's the magic of that. Sometimes your strengths are actually in your wither column. Stuff that you are just burned out, or you became proficient at it because you were told to, or for whatever reason you drove into.
What one was for me? I get bored with it. It's easy.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, I do too. I like variety. So that variety is in my thrive column. Now, so I did it in necessity for me. And what happened is an open door happened for me here in Charlotte, North Carolina, halfway across the country. Never been to Charlotte. Like it. It's got trees and it's got more sunshine and it's got hills and it's closer to the ocean than Kansas. So like Nirvana is beautiful. But and every time I've been brought into companies, like I said, I'm a college dropout, not because I wanted to be, but I had a full-time job offer at the height of the largest unemployment since the Great Depression in 1982. And my advisor said, Gary, you got to take this job. And it was $10,500 a year, no benefits. I mean, come on, think about that. But I did. And every job I've had since then was master's preferred and bachelor's required. Well, guess what? That's a problem. That's a real problem. And many times, and it's always been because somebody knew me and had worked with me. They called me into something. Always. And many times they were pulling stuff off of my thrive column that I didn't see myself, because I kept saying, I don't have any experience in that industry. I mean, I've gotten drug into all kinds of industries that I had zero experience in. So what I love doing, and this is free for anybody out there, and I charge $7,500 a day plus everything else. It's like, hey, and this is one of the things that we do with all the management teams. We always do a thrive wither with them, and then we butt that up against a function accountability chart on who's in charge of what. And then we start horse trading responsibilities. The CEO is still the CEO. Don't worry about it. CFO is still the CFO. But guess what? There are times that I've seen certain things that the CEO said, I hate doing it, but I got to do it because CEOs do that. I'm like, says who? The CEO police? Like, no, you get to choose, like, let's custom fit this suit instead of just taking something off the rack and it's like falling down, or choking you. No. So that's what we do. That thrive wither is extremely powerful. Well, how does it silence the imposter? Here's what I found. When you are in the zone, when you're in your flow state, your high flow state, and you're really jamming, you got no time to be hearing about the doubts. Like, you're just having fun. Have you ever seen a kid where Johnny, and they are just like focused? It's not that because they have hard of hearing that they're hard of hearing. It's because they are focused. They're in the flow. Same thing happens with imposter syndrome. Same thing.
Yeah, I think we naturally gravitate towards those things that we thrive in and we really enjoy it, and it makes it easier for us, and we can we're leaning into those things, right? We're avoiding the stuff where it does make us feel like an imposter when we're not into it. And you mentioned some different things in your career and picking opportunities and stuff, and I think before we leave this behavior bucket, I do want to ask you a little bit about being anything but typical, because that's your podcast. And since people are listening or watching a podcast right now, we should talk like niching yourself down actually creates benefit here. Where we think it's the opposite, that if I can just be all things to all people, that then I will have this safety net. But it's actually when you say no to a bunch of these things that cause you to wither, you start becoming unique, which makes you more valuable. And so if you're submitting your job on an online platform and it has requirements and degrees and things required, you're already in trouble. You're going to have a really hard time standing out, and you're going to feel like an imposter because they want all of this huge wish list. But when you're unique and somebody says, oh, you know what? We need to hire Gary for this role. Let's let him write the job description. Then you feel confident about it. You don't have the imposter because you're like, okay, I'm picking the things that I want to do here and what I don't want to do. And they're looking for somebody with my unique talents and experience, not some sort of bar that I have to jump over. I know that's been your experience, but can you tell us a little bit why it's more important to be atypical?
Well, because we're all created that way, quite frankly. That's why we call it the Anything But Typical
We don't
podcast.
have a choice anyway. Yeah.
We're super excited that you're going to be a guest on the Anything But Typical podcast. And when my co-host asked me to start a podcast with him almost 5 years ago now, I said, yes, I would love to, because he sold his first company when he was 24. He's a hardcore entrepreneur. He's really talented. He's in his early 30s now. And I'd been on his podcast 7 years ago, but I said, Ben, I'd love to do it, but two conditions. One, we call it Anything But Typical. And he goes, why is that? And I said, because we're all created that way. Our thumbprints prove it. Before I met my wife and married her, I had dated two different young ladies, and both of them had identical twins. So they weren't each other twins. But here's one thing that I found out early on, and they were both identical twin, different families, but unbelievable. Neither of them had the same thumbprint. They had different and unique fingerprints. And I think that's by design. But I think when we get into trouble, we try to fit into a mold and be like everybody else. And that's what I struggled with for so long. I thought everybody else was normal, and I was trying to be normal. Well, that's kind of a misnomer. So the other thing that I said is that I want to focus on people that are willing to tell the behind the scenes reels, entrepreneurs, because that's who we serve, business owners, because everybody has a story. Everybody, whether you're not, an entrepreneur or not, but that's just our niche. And the other thing that I would say is, you mentioned this when you niche down. I used to call it the Venturi tube effect. So if you go back to science, remember, a Venturi tube narrows, and what happens in the middle of it? Particles accelerate in the middle of the Venturi tube. That same thing happens when we narrow, when we nope, this is what I do. And when you're secure in that, it brings extreme liberty. And what I found too is, this is what's so funny. CEOs who you go, well, they have it all together. No, they don't. They're just like you and me, and they don't know what they're doing most of the time. But they look at other CEOs and they go, oh, well, this is what a CEO does. I suck at this thing or that thing.
Right.
They may suck at those things, but they keep trying to grunt it and grind it out instead of acknowledging it and just dropping the armor and just saying, you know what, I suck at this. There are always going to be people out there, whether they're on your team or they need to be on your team, that actually love doing the stuff that you suck at and you hate doing. That's the beauty of that.
I want to add two quick stories of examples, and then we would need to move to technique, because you got some cool techniques here too. One is, I think the pandemic was the final proving ground for me. In that first quarter, second quarter of 2020, it was clear that the most brilliant people on the planet had no idea what to do next. And you go, oh, well, if they're just making it up as they go along and they're having to change their mind, that's what we're all doing. Nobody had a game plan for this. No, nobody knew what it was. The other one, it's my favorite story of all time to tell. I've probably told it many times on the podcast, so I'll give you the short version. But I was fired from a really big opportunity in my entertainment days. I get to open for Billy Idol. And I was fired live on stage by Billy Idol's manager in front of thousands of people.
Oh, man.
And that's what made me bulletproof. It finally, it was a really tough situation, but I go, oh, wait a second. I have already been through the hardest thing. So now I can go on any podcast, any stage, any opportunity and go, I've already done the hardest thing. So it actually gave me confidence. And I think a lot of people don't realize that when you fail and you get through things, that's what actually builds your confidence. Not when you play it safe, try to be everything to everybody and never get fired. That's when you end up in trouble and you start doubting yourself. But when you go, this is me, these are my strengths, these are the situations I thrive in. And if something goes wrong, it's not me personally. It's that it was the wrong situation or a wrong opportunity or just a learning experience.
Right.
Now that experience gives me the confidence to move forward. We talked about one of them. You have 6 other tools in your book for weapons for fighting the imposter. We don't need to go through all of them, but do you have any tips, tools, tactics that we should know about if we were running into this?
So you mentioned one of them that takes the most courage. That's why I wear this t-shirt anytime I talk about imposter syndrome. And that is, you shined a light on what you were trying to keep hidden.
Yeah.
That takes tremendous amount of courage but it's extremely liberating. So remember the woman that I said that had 10,000 employees that said, Gary, I don't know what I'm doing? Tana Green. Well, she early on, before I started coaching her, she gave me her book, and it's called Creating a World of Difference. And in this book, she did exactly that. She put a spotlight on stuff that she didn't want anybody to know while she's hobnobbing in the WPO crowd of all these women CEOs. And she didn't have quite 10,000 at the point. She probably had 5,000 employees at the time. But she wrote in here that she had a child at age 15 out of wedlock. Not something you want to talk about here in the South. She ends up having the baby, getting married to the guy. And as soon as that happened, he's abusive and he beats her up so badly. She's in the hospital and he abandons her and the baby. Don't want to talk about that either. So she wants to go and get her high school degree, diploma. She doesn't want to do a GED. So she goes back, baby in tow, graduates 2 years behind her graduating class. That takes tremendous humility and courage. And she wants to go to college. She dreamed of going to college. Well, single mom, she can't afford it. So that's why she goes to secretarial school. She kept all that stuff hidden forever until she wrote this book. And I said, Tana, what was that like? And she said, it was terrifying initially. But she said, once I did, it set me free. And it set a whole bunch of people free. She speaks all over the country on domestic abuse and that sort of thing. And she talks about it. So you do it. You do the same thing. Hey, man, can you imagine getting yanked off the stage? You're doing your cool thing for Billy Idol, and then boom, the shepherd's crook comes out and pulls you off stage. I mean, how embarrassing. But guess what? It did make you bulletproof. But you had to admit it, because most people will be like, and all of a sudden, if they say Billy Idol, all of a sudden you're triggered. They don't know.
I don't like white weddings. Okay. No, I got it. Now I want to get to know you a little bit better too before we let you go, because I think you did share a lot of the story. You've had a lot of successes, a lot of failures, and I think that's the way everything goes. At this point in your career, after all of this, how do you define success for yourself?
It ties into understanding what my core values are and what my core purpose is. And in 2003, I read for the first out of 3 times, read The Purpose Driven Life by Rick Warren. And I actually wrote down what was my purpose. And, Simon Sinek has done a great job of monetizing that and making it simple and clear for people to understand your why, right? But for me, everything ties back to that, because I've seen people that had tremendous success materially. I've worked with billionaires and down, and some amazing, wonderful people, and also some extremely miserable people. And it was never about what were their accolades, how many Emmys did they win, blah, blah, blah. What sports teams did they own? It was never about that. It comes down to integrity. And for me, it comes down to my why. So I wrote my why. And here's my why. To do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That's Micah 6:8. And to make a positive difference in the lives of others. Because here's the deal. I've been brotherized by people that said Micah 6:8. I have lost millions to people that said it, but their character and their deeds did not line up. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm just looking for humility and honesty. And so for me, the litmus test is, would my children and my wife, who know me better than anybody, I've been married, it'll be 41 years this summer, or the colleagues that I work with, or the people that have worked for me, would they say he made a positive difference in my life? whether they like me, like my theology, like what I believed in or not, would they say, you made a positive difference? If so, success. If not, failure.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. Was there a particularly hard lesson learned along your career? I know you shared a bunch of these in the book too, but
Yeah.
one that you would like to shine a light on that was like, oh man, I needed to get through that in order to be
This
successful.
one will probably save your life because it saved my life. Gratitude journal. In 2009, my forever home of what I thought was going to be my forever gig, because I invested in this private equity firm in 2004. They put me on the board and bought my consultancy in 2005. In 2009, we lost $30 million worth of us got wiped out. CEO, who I counted among my closest friends, gone. We had invested in 2 Ponzi's on top of it, 2.2 billion and $500 million. I lost everything except for my house. I had 2 kids in college, and there was no way. How are we going to do this? And then it was, the board says, Gary, they threw out the CEO. We discovered he was a fraud, which was devastating. And then we had to shut down 11 offices and 90 people gone. And then the lawsuits started rolling every week. And it didn't just happen for a couple of weeks. It went on for years. Like, they just released some of the people from federal penitentiaries recently. And I got notified because I had money in that crap. Well, I didn't want to wake up in the morning, man. I mean, I did not. That's where I learned the power of gratitude. And it wasn't for the things. My circumstances didn't change. It kept getting worse. But I went from night terrors and not sleeping and waking up at 140 beats a minute when my resting heart rate was 39 at the time, to being able to sleep like a baby when things got worse. And it wasn't grateful for the stuff. It was grateful despite it, and finding something to be grateful for. So I write 3 things I'm grateful for, ... followed by a thought or a prayer every day. And I've got years of journals that no one else has ever seen, no one else will ever read, but they're for me. And so as a problem solver, it's very easy. And I was trained as a designer. I see the flaws. It's just, I can pick them out, and it's one of my superpowers, but it's also kryptonite. And so we can't ignore the problems, but what are we going to focus on? And so for me, is I got to find something to be grateful for. I mean, I can't see out of this eye right now. I had macular, but retina detachment. We were supposed to be doing this, and I had to get wheeled in for surgery because within a day, boom, I was blind in this eye. I still can't see diddly squat. However, I'm not grateful for that, but I'm grateful that I can see out of this eye, and I'm grateful I can see colors and shapes now, and I'm grateful I'm breathing. Like, these are things that I can find gratitude for. And guess what? We all go through stuff. We all have difficulties. We all have stuff that happened to us that we didn't want, or things that we did that we wish we wouldn't have done. What are you going to do about it? Gratitude journal.
Love that. Now, last question might be a hard one for you with the amount of books on the shelf behind you back there, and how you think, but real short. Do you have a favorite quote, motto, or mantra?
There was a quote, but it was by another ad agency back in the time, Young and Rubicam. And Young and Rubicam was a global juggernaut. And they had this annual poster contest, and it was always around this: resist the usual. Resist the usual. And we were doing television commercials in Toronto, and I see this poster, and it's a fire hydrant peeing, squirting out, and hitting a dog in the face. And the dog's like, it was hilarious. And I'm like, that is awesome. They gave me a copy of that, but that was Young and Rubicam Toronto office that had done this. They did this global poster contest. So I love that. Resist the usual.
Yeah. I am right on board with you there. And if you want to check out the book, go find Silence the Imposter wherever you buy your books. If you want to
Just on
connect with
Amazon.
Gary, I would just say go to LinkedIn. He mentioned the CPA firm. It's also a coach and involved with Sandler training as well. And so living up to is anything but typical moniker. It's hard to put everything into the resume and bio here, but go check him out, Gary Frey on LinkedIn, and check out the Anything But Typical podcast, because we're going to go record one of those right now. I'm going to be a guest on his show. And as always, don't forget to learn more about Sandler at sandler.com. Ton of free resources. Subscribe to the podcast. Send this episode to somebody that you can hear it. And if you need help with your leadership development, go to sandler.com, click on Find a Training location, and we will see you there. Until next time, whatever you are, be a good one. Later.
Thanks, Mike.